forever. Youth presents itself, at least in its marketing logline, as a story of unexpected connection. But a closer and more honest look at its actual narrative mechanics reveals something considerably more troubling, and it is worth naming that plainly before any deeper thematic analysis can proceed. Because the story as constructed is not a romance that happens to involve deception as a minor complication, it is fundamentally a catfishing narrative, one in which an older woman, Dana, cultivates a romantic and emotional connection with a younger person online under false pretenses, allows that younger person to develop genuine feelings, genuine anticipation, genuine vulnerability, and only permits the truth of her actual age and identity to surface after she has successfully arranged a weekend alone together. And treating this structure as a foundation for tender, admirable queer intimacy would require overlooking the extent to which the entire relationship, from its very first exchange, was built on a calculated asymmetry of information that Avi never consented to and could not have consented to, because consent requires knowing what and whom you are actually agreeing to connect with. This distinction matters enormously and should not be softened by the eventual reveal of Dana's youthful mannerisms or her nervous, almost childlike hesitance once real-world responsibility enters the picture, because those details, rather than redeeming the earlier deception, actually compound the ethical problem, since they suggest a person who may herself be somewhat emotionally arrested or conflict avoidant, someone who curated an online persona not necessarily out of predatory calculation, but out of her own unresolved fear of being seen accurately. And while that interior explanation may generate a certain narrative sympathy for Dana as a character, it does nothing to change the material reality of what she did to Avi, luring a younger person into an emotionally invested long-distance relationship under false representation, and then engineering a scenario in which that younger person would be isolated with her before the truth came out. It is important to be precise about why this matters so much within the specific context of queer women's stories, because representation of lesbian and sapphic relationships already carries a disproportionate cultural burden, existing in a media landscape that has historically either erased women's desire for one another entirely or, when it has been depicted, frequently filtered that desire through a lens of transgression, secrecy, or taboo designed primarily for outside consumption rather than authentic reflection of queer women's actual emotional lives. And a narrative like this one, which packages catfishing and engineered isolation as a swoon-worthy meet-cute, risks reinforcing exactly the cultural association many queer women have spent decades trying to dismantle, the idea that love between women is inherently marked by concealment, by trickery, by relationships that cannot survive full honesty and must instead be built on partial truths until circumstance forces disclosure. Genuine queer intimacy, the kind worth holding up as meaningful and worth centering in fiction meant to affirm rather than exploit, depends on exactly the conditions this story withholds from its protagonist: mutual honesty from the outset, the ability to consent to a connection with accurate information about who the other person actually is, and the freedom to build trust incrementally rather than have that trust manufactured through months of false representation before being detonated in person. And a story that instead romanticizes the moment of realization, that lingers on Avi's frozen disbelief and then pivots toward continued engagement rather than immediate clear-eyed boundary setting, asks its audience to find something charming or fated in a dynamic that, stripped of its swooning framing, describes a person discovering they have been lied to by someone who wanted access to them badly enough to misrepresent fundamental facts about her identity. This is worth dwelling on specifically because age and identity deception in the context of online relationships carries real, well-documented harms that extend well beyond the fictional frame of this particular story. And while Avi is apparently an adult in this narrative, the mechanics being romanticized here, someone constructing a false persona specifically calibrated to appeal to a younger person's stated preferences, cultivating emotional investment before revealing anything the target might have used to make an informed choice about pursuing the connection at all, mirror the exact tactics used in real predatory grooming behavior, and fiction does not need to depict minors to still be reproducing and normalizing patterns that cause genuine harm when they occur between adults of significantly different life stages and levels of vulnerability, particularly when one party has spent considerable effort ensuring the other could not make a fully informed decision. What the narrative gets specifically wrong, from a craft and ethics standpoint, is its apparent interest in generating sympathy for Dana's deception by attributing it to her own insecurity and emotional immaturity, because this move, however psychologically plausible as a character explanation, functions narratively as an excuse rather than an accountability, inviting the audience to forgive the initial catfishing because the catfisher herself seems fragile and sympathetic, rather than asking the audience to sit with the actual impact of that deception on Avi, whose interior experience, her shock, her disorientation, the vertigo of realizing that the person she had been building feelings for does not exist in the form she believed, is treated as a brief beat of comedy or awkwardness to be moved past quickly, rather than as a genuine violation worth reckoning with at length. A more honest and more genuinely affirming version of this story, one actually interested in queer women's authentic emotional lives rather than the aesthetic trappings of swoony romance, would need to slow down considerably at the moment of revelation and allow Avi real interiority around betrayal, confusion, and the difficult work of deciding what, if anything, she owes to a connection built on false premises. And it is worth noting that Avi's own instinct within the story, to quietly take Dana's phone and call her sister to verify the truth, rather than confront Dana directly or simply accept whatever explanation might be offered, actually models something valuable and underexplored. A self-protective instinct toward independent verification that deserves to be centered and honored by the narrative, rather than treated as a brief detour on the way back toward romantic reconciliation, because that instinct reflects real emotional intelligence. The recognition that when someone has already demonstrated a willingness to misrepresent significant facts about themselves, their own account of events cannot be the only source of information used to evaluate whether to continue trusting them. This detail, small as it is within the plot as summarized, is actually the most narratively honest moment available in the entire premise, because it depicts a woman refusing to simply accept a comforting or convenient story, and instead doing the harder, more self-protective work of seeking outside confirmation, and had the film chosen to build its emotional and thematic weight around this instinct, around Avi's growing self-trust and her willingness to protect her own judgment, even in the face of genuine attraction or hope, it would have told a considerably more valuable story about queer women's emotional lives. One about the difficulty and necessity of maintaining boundaries, even when doing so means walking away from a connection that initially felt significant, rather than a story that seems structured to reward the audience's investment in the deception paying off romantically, regardless of how it began. There is a broader pattern worth naming here as well, because stories that romanticize deception as a prelude to intimacy tend to reflect and reinforce a cultural discomfort with women, and particularly queer women, setting firm boundaries and prioritizing their own safety and clarity over the emotional needs or fragility of another person, since women are so frequently socialized to prioritize kindness, understanding, and the maintenance of connection, even in situations where walking away would be the healthier and more self-respecting choice. And a narrative that frames Avi's likely eventual acceptance of Dana, despite the catfishing, as the emotionally satisfying resolution risks modeling exactly this kind of conditioned self-abandonment, teaching its audience, implicitly, that love or the appearance of love justifies overlooking significant breaches of honesty and trust. This matters specifically for lesbian and queer women audiences, because so much of queer community intimacy, as explored in more thoughtfully constructed narratives, depends on the ability to build trust incrementally and honestly, precisely because queer women have often had fewer socially sanctioned scripts to fall back on, fewer external structures like traditional courtship norms or family involvement that might otherwise catch or flag concerning behavior early, which means queer women frequently have to rely more heavily on their own internal judgment and willingness to verify, to question, to protect themselves. And a story that undermines the value of that instinct by rushing past it in favor of romantic resolution does a disservice to the audience it claims to be centering. Ultimately, a genuinely critical reading of Forever Youth suggests that its premise, whatever tenderness or vulnerability it may aim for in its execution, is undermined at the foundational level by its uncritical romanticization of catfishing and engineered isolation, and that the story would be considerably more valuable, both as craft and as a piece of queer representation, if it took seriously the harm embedded in its own premise, allowing Avi's shock, her verification instinct, and her eventual decisions about trust and boundaries to be treated with the narrative weight they deserve, rather than functioning as brief obstacles on the way to a swoon the story has not actually earned.